Good afternoon and welcome to this webinar on gender parity and change management. My name is Gemma and I'm here hosting the webinar with Mark Thompson, the Programme Director, who I'll introduce you to shortly. The webinar will be run by Rebecca Hill, a Director at Global Markets for Ernst & Young, and Brian Evje, an advisor at Astia. They're both alumni from the programme and they're both very excited to talk to you around gender parity and change management and how they are interrelated. But before we start, I just wanted to run through a few housekeeping points. The webinar will last until 3 p.m. this afternoon. There will be an opportunity for you to ask questions, and if you'd like to do so, please feel free to type your questions into the question box at the bottom of your right-hand panel. If you have any questions around using that, just let me know on the chat and I can help you. And I'll be fielding those questions at around about 10 to 3 to give us ample opportunity to ask questions. So feel free to do that as you wish. If we don't get a chance to answer all the questions, I will be able to come back to you in the email following this webinar. So without further ado, I will pass you over to Mark Thompson to introduce himself, and then we'll introduce the panellists and then start the discussion. Thank you, Mark.
Hi, good afternoon, everyone. So I'm Mark Thompson. I am the Academic Director of the programme from the Oxford side. As you know, it's a joint partnership between Oxford and HSA, and I've been in this role for 10 years now. And I must admit it's a great pleasure to be able to introduce Rebecca and Brian as alumni of the programme, because one of the things that we really love about this programme is what people go on to do and the types of issues they get involved with. And just this weekend we had our alumni meeting of the change leaders in Paris, where they were talking about systems change and systems theory, and complexity, one of the big themes in the programme. But another one which is really important, which is, as you will hear, seems to be an intractable issue, is really around gender and gender progression and changing organisations. So we're really pleased to have Rebecca come, who was actually with us in cohort 4 in the programme, so that's nearly 10 years ago, to talk about that theme. I'll say more about the programme later in this webinar, but great to have these guys here. I'm looking forward to it.
Thank you, Mark. That's great. I'm just going to introduce Rebecca, who's going to be our first panellist on the programme, on this webinar today. Good afternoon, Rebecca. How are you?
Hello, I'm very well.
Thanks. Thank you. So without further ado, Rebecca, if you want to fire away, I'll move to the first slide for you.
Thank you, Gemma, and thank you, Mark. And hello, everyone. I'm really delighted to be invited to join the webinar today. It's been a really interesting journey, actually, preparing for it, and has brought back some really interesting points for me, points of learning from CCC, and also been fantastic to collaborate with Brian and with Gemma in the preparation. So thank you for that. Really today I want to just talk very briefly about the work that I'm doing with EY around accelerating gender parity in the workplace, and then maybe spend a bit of time talking about how my learning from CC really impacted the work that I'm doing, because I firmly believe it has. So the question I would ask all of you to think about as well as we go through this webinar is, as change leaders in your own right, is, you know, what is it that you could be doing in the work that you do to really address the issue of gender parity in the workplace? So I'm going to go through at quite some pace. Hopefully this is some familiar territory for many of you, but also some helpful points to really get to grips. So I'm hoping, Gemma, the sound quality is all right, and there's no feedback at this point.
Absolutely.
Brilliant. Okay, so I think many of us have been wrestling with this issue for a long period of time, as Mark alluded to, and much of the work that has been done is really around the fairness issue. It's the right thing to do to have you know, equal gender representation across all levels of organisation and business. But increasingly, you know, there is a lot of research that's coming out that articulates just what the impact is of having gender parity within the workplace, and really therefore articulating quite succinctly why this needs to be addressed. So you know, as this slide says, you know, we are in a period of profound change with you know, aging populations, climate change, you know, particularly the rapid advancement of technology, and all those different megatrends, if we want to use management speak, are really impacting the way we work and the workplaces within which we work. And I think that means that many of our leadership teams are ill-equipped at the moment to lead the businesses that they're leading. And arguably, if you look at you know, the statistics, many of those leadership teams are not very diverse, which is almost, you know, exacerbating, if you like, the challenge. And so if just one statistic that I can throw out there at the moment is, you know, of the CEOs on the FTSE 100 that we have at the moment, you know, there are vacillates between 5 and 6% women CEOs. So, you know, there is a real issue here around you know, getting more women through into the leadership levels of our organisations. With the number of women increasingly, well, universities now are, I think, over 50% of graduates now are women, and so over 50% of people joining the workforce at that level are women, and in many organisations like my own, you know, that then does drop off very, very rapidly, as you can see from the pyramid that Gemma's put up on the screen. And you know, the question we have to ask ourselves really is, you know, what is happening to these women? That's one of the questions. Why if we know that having more women in business delivers better results, where are they going? I think clearly they're not disappearing. Most of them are remaining economically active, but we are failing to retain them in our businesses through to the senior levels of leadership. And many of those individuals are getting, I would say, quite stuck as well in those middle sort of middle positions, and we're just not pulling them through. So that's really you know, what we're trying to articulate here on this slide. And Brian, I don't know if you have any observations on that yourself as to, you know, what might be going on here.
Thanks, Rebecca. The one statistic to point out specifically in the United States is that more than 50% of undergraduates are women, and it's been that way for about 35 years. More than 50% of master's graduates and PhD graduates are also women. But there is definitely a systems issue, and building on the theme of the Change Leaders Conference this weekend in Paris, it's really an example of coming up against a good deal of complexity that's pretty entrenched. And for all of the discussion that we've had around women leaning in as individuals and as a collective gender, there's really a point where that's just not sufficient, and it's sort of distracting from the argument, because you can only lean so far into a system that doesn't recognize you, that doesn't have a place for you, that historically has looked to separate you from the system in order to be a part of it. So I think that this is so difficult because it is so much at the intersection of many business and social issues. And the key for us, certainly at Astia, is to talk about this most clearly from a future-based business imperative, meaning businesses in the future simply will understand this in ways that businesses in the past have not. And how we get senior leaders to recognize this and actually start to do something about it without feeling that they have to unravel their entire enterprise and then rebuild it in some other way is a big challenge. And that's why a lot of EY's perspective and tools and frameworks help leaders understand some of these issues, so it's not nearly as daunting as it would be without this kind of expertise. That's my little plug for EY.
Thank you, Brian. No, I appreciate that, and we're going to talk a little bit later about a couple of those, you know, the things that can be done to accelerate female talent. So, you know, if we know, and actually the research is quite interesting because, you know, some of the things that people say is, well, women aren't as ambitious, but you know, there is quite a lot of research out there, particularly from Michelle Ryan, ex-university, it's one example, around women and ambition. And I think women are as ambitious as men, but maybe the way they display it is different. And so there's some very key issues here that playing out. Thank you, Gemma, for the next slide. This is a slide that I use an awful lot because, oh, I think we're missing a little bit of text on the right-hand side, possibly. But the first point really is around improved financial performance. So, you know, I always joke, actually, there is so much new research coming out almost on a daily basis that you could literally sink a ship with it. But you know, a lot of the research that we've had most recently has been around how having a more gender diverse team does improve the financial performance of organisations. A lot of that has been around having more diversity in the boardroom. And by diversity, I think, you know, we are specifically talking about gender, but you know, there are many different forms of diversity. But the research here is specifically around gender, and I think it's also important to highlight that it's not just about having one or two women. It is about critical mass. So where you hit, Mackenzie talk about, you know, 30%, where the minority turns into sort of a group that has a voice. And so where you have that critical mass is where you will start seeing certainly some improvement on financial performance. So if we look at the most recent study that was done by the Peterson Institute, yes, EY was involved with that one, but is about, and that piece is very interesting because it's actually about gender representation within the C-suite and not just within the boardroom, and what happens on the financial performance of organisations. And I could cite quite a few statistics here from other pieces of research by the Credit Suisse Institute, Catalyst, and Mackenzie again, and they're quite well documented around what that impact is. The second point that I would just highlight is around innovation, and I know, Brian, you're going to talk a little bit about the disruption piece and the innovation piece a bit later on, but you know, there is also a lot of research now that highlights really the impact of having greater diversity, gender diversity, on innovation, or actually the lack of that gender diversity. There was a very interesting piece of kit that Apple developed recently that was going to take care of everyone's healthcare needs, but unfortunately those were healthcare needs primarily of men, it turned out, because there was no tracking of things like the menopause in the kit that they developed. And so you know, so it is absolutely important or crucial that, you know, from an innovation perspective, that we have gender diversity as well. The third indicator that I've listed there is crucial from an organisational perspective, and it's around mirroring your customer. So if you think about the fact that most discretionary spending decisions are made by women, so 80% of discretionary spending decisions are made by women, you know, you better make sure that your you know, your organisation across the board is mirroring your customer. Another interesting stat that I like to cite is, you know, Mothercare, which is a company that we all know quite well, up until a few years ago didn't have a single woman on their board, which seems extraordinary when you think about the organisation and the customers. So that's just another example that I would give as to why having greater diversity is crucial. The fourth one here is around effective risk management, and again, there's a lot of research here around this issue. And I think it hangs on the fact that women we're talking here about stereotypes, but stereotypically have a different risk profile to men, and so there is benefit in having those different approaches represented in decision-making process and in business leadership. And an interesting stat here from one piece of research is just having one female director on the board can cut the risk of bankruptcy by 20%. So, that's a piece of research done by London Business School. So the next indicator that I just wanted to highlight was around governance, and that's the final one, and that's really around just a more rigorous decision-making process. And this is fairly well articulated and studied now, the case for greater diversity in the workplace, and it goes beyond the case for, it's the right thing to do, the social justice case. And so therefore, I think, from a change practitioner's perspective, this is a very interesting framework to have when you're working with businesses on change. So the question then is, so what is EY's response to this? So what are we doing about this if we believe so firmly that gender diversity is absolutely crucial to the success of business? What is our response to that? And we, just over a year ago, we launched what we call a platform, Women Fast Forward, at Davos at the World Economic Forum, which was highlighting really the fact that it's going to take another 170 years to achieve gender parity, and particularly why we felt this was just unacceptable in the work context. And as a result of that, and I should say that is a piece of research that is repeated on a regular basis. Initially, when we had launched it, it was 80 years. It's actually gone back 37 years in the last year alone. And so that is a platform that we have gone out and to market on and said we need to do something about this, working with what we call the Power of Three, governments, entrepreneurship and big business, to address this, because no one single party has the answer to this issue. It is kind of, in a way, one of the ultimate change challenges, as Mark alluded to, and so we need to be collaborating on this together across the board. So I just want to highlight just a couple of points that we touched upon in the report, and you can access, and I don't wish to plug it too heavily, but if you are interested, you can access this report online, and Gemma's going to follow up after the webcast with a bit more detail. The top line sort of findings, if you like, are highlighted here. But I think really the biggest challenge that we identified was that unconscious bias is really at the root of the challenge around getting more women into and through that pyramid that we talked about earlier on in the call. And as a result of that, we did identify 3 major accelerators to address, potentially the issue of getting more women into the business and up through the business. And Gemma, maybe you could.
Rebecca,
hello.
Can I just ask, just point
sure.
of clarification? You said that men see unconscious bias as a barrier. Do women also see that?
Yes, they do. I think. Yeah, it's an interesting one, because we did separate, so we asked men and women the questions, but I think, from a male perspective, they see that as an issue, as do women.
So men see it equally. Okay.
Yeah. So maybe we could just talk quickly about the 3 major accelerators that we identified, and again, Brian, it would be great to get your thoughts on these. Illuminating the path to leadership. This is about making it visible to women what is possible, because a lot of the work that we've done, a lot of the research we've done is to ask women, what the piece around what is their ambition level, and yes, they are ambitious, but a lot of the women cannot see how they can make it work. They can't see how they get to that level, often because there are no other women in those roles, and so there is there's a little quote, you cannot be what you cannot see, and I think that's really a lot of what's at play here, is around articulating to women more clearly what is the path to leadership. And certainly at EY, that is something that we do through a number of different channels, including a number of focused, tailored programs that we have to support women, where they have the opportunity to network with each other, but then also network with other women leaders to see what their route was and how they got there. And then the second piece is really about the speeding up of the company culture change with progressive corporate policy. So for us, that means looking at how we manage our talent pipelines, and how we make sure that the unconscious bias piece is addressed through those processes, and where necessary, looking at things like targets, and also where we feel we need to be running certain training. So we have inclusive leadership training, because diversity on its own doesn't necessarily give you, the desired effects. You have to then also be able to manage that diverse workforce. And then the third piece is really about making sure that you build those supportive environments. And here we at EY have done an awful lot of work around what we call flexible working. So making it possible for people, individuals, women and men, to to be able to work as flexibly as possible in order to do the work that they need to do, the role that they need to do. So so those are just some examples of what we have been doing around the three major accelerators. And Brian, I don't know if there's anything you'd like to add to those.
I think in terms of specific solutions, I think this is a great framework. I would certainly echo a lot of the comments and a lot of the research around unconscious bias. I think that as change leaders, the thing we have to be able to do is anticipate the point at which the unconscious bias becomes conscious, in the sense that there's so much discussion about it now. Yeah. People who are in charge and have power within the kinds of organizations we're trying to influence will no longer be able to say, gee, this is unconscious, I'm not aware of it. And what that points to for primarily the men who are running these organizations is the need to have some way forward to figure out how to go about addressing this. And as we know, with change, it's hard to make change, because you have to admit that, well, up to this point, you haven't done something different. And I think there is a real thought leadership opportunity to help the gender discussion to move forward by helping men recognize that the things we're talking about here, these kinds of solutions, are simply a better way of doing business. They're a better way of working and living, if you're trying to struggle with that balance. And it's simply the right thing to do. So as CCC looks at in a number of dimensions, there are great opportunities to challenge the status quo. And in this case, I think they're very personal issues, they're very uncomfortable issues, and it's just the kind of complexity that that we should be leading. But it's pretty hard, as all of this discussion acknowledges.
Maybe I could add something here as well. On CCC, we do some stuff on social networks and looking at those from different perspectives, and gender is one of those issues, but we also work with people in the classroom trying to map out their social network space. This is very relevant if you think about some of the issues we're talking about in terms of progression and up into more senior levels. What a lot of the research shows is that women tend to there's this kind of what we call homophily, where they seek people who are similar to them, so they tend to bind together quite closely with other women. But actually, a lot of the power in the organisation and decisions over career progression is actually decided by men, be it with unconscious bias or not. Or as one famous scientist I was at a dinner with in Oxford. I have to bring in the Oxford story, obviously, to make this relevant. She was asked about her career. And she got to quite a senior position, but it took quite a long time. And after much reflection, she said, "Well, I really didn't understand how it took so long, but on reflection, I think it was just misogyny at the end of the day." But then she went on to talk about other things in terms of access to more senior men who you can be where you can be visible.
Yeah, absolutely.
Actually, yeah. So it's actually how do you make those networks actually more diverse? So this is a kind of interesting point of discussion when you talk about you have female-only training programs, which can be very good for bonding amongst women, and also if you can bring in some women leaders, that's important. But if you think about the kind of maybe more heterogeneity in programs where you can bring in more powerful men and they can spot talented women and they get more comfortable with that, and et cetera, that works. And we've done that actually with an organisation here in Oxford, the Royal Mail Group, which has been reasonably successful. 50% of the female participants and 50% men. But we have a mix of hierarchy in there. And what we've kind of discovered over time is that women are progressing much faster in Royal Mail because there's
yeah, but that's very interesting, Mark. I mean, you benefit there from having a female CEO, right?
Yeah.
So she's and she's interested and she's passionate about it, and she believes in the benefits that her organisation will have, and I absolutely agree with you. I mean, just creating women-only programs is a bit what Brian alluded to before. That's women leaning in, and it's not that there needs to be an opportunity there to raise their profile amongst the predominantly male sort of leadership, and that's why the concept of things like sponsorship is so very important. And I think that's a bit of what you're talking about with the Royal Mail Group and the work that the Centre for Talent Innovation has done around sponsorship is absolutely fascinating. We have sponsorship programs within EY, but it's a difficult concept to put into a formal program. Often sponsorship is a very organic thing, and works best organically.
Yeah, and I think in the Royal Mail program it does work on a more organic level. So that I think you're right, because talent is multidimensional. Okay, I won't interrupt anymore.
No, it's very helpful. No, thank you for that. So I think, just moving on then, I did want to, I think I've said this already, I did just want to highlight that, 117 years clearly is far too long. I think we all agree with that. Well, I hope we all agree with it.
We'll be dead anyway.
Well, yeah. So, what is it that we can do? And I think we have to recognise we are on a journey, and so we have to figure out a way to make it sustainable, so that we feel that that we are achieving progress, and that we can see that things are changing, and that is a real challenge around this particular issue. It's easy to think the issue is being addressed, and in fact most recently the 30% Club, which is an organisation that's been very, very active initially getting more women into the boardroom, did a piece of research looking with CEOs, and the vast majority of them actually felt that this issue is now being addressed, but the fact is, as we know when we look at the numbers, that's not the case. So there is clearly a disconnect here. So how do we keep that momentum and that focus going so that we do move forward? And then I just thought, as participants on this webcast, maybe we could take a moment just to sort of reflect on a couple of questions as we move into the next stage of this this discussion. So picking up on what we've covered, are you making a conscious effort to address unconscious bias? To Brian's point, is that part and parcel of our role as change leaders in the work that we're doing? Do the pathways within your organisations or the organisations you're working with to leadership include women? If not, why not? What's going on there? Have a the data is absolutely crucial here. Are your teams diverse enough to really unleash that innovative spirit and new ways of thinking? I would also say, when you're looking at that piece, that goes back to, if not, what's going on with the leadership there? Because you really need inclusive leaders who get this in order to unleash that diverse piece, the uplift, if you like, the innovation piece. And then, do women in your organisations get the same support from senior leadership as male counterparts? I think that really that was what what you were alluding to as well. So just a few questions for you to think about. I did want to just flag very, very quickly the work that I've been doing around a particular forum that we created called Women the Power of Three, which is for women and men across government, corporate and entrepreneurship, and a report that we published at Davos earlier this year. Again, you can access that online afterwards, but I think you might find that quite interesting because we go into these issues in a bit more detail, and also some of the recommendations that around actions that can be taken are highlighted there. I think one thing that was very, very interesting when we released the report at Davos was and I don't want to mix up too many subjects here, but was the growing impact of digital on women and gender parity in the workplace as well. And I know Brian's going to pick up on that a bit more in a minute. But just to say, there's a lot of very good information out there that hopefully you having listened to this part of the webcast, you can kind of pick up and look at in a bit more detail. Now we obviously got a bit more Q&A as well to come. So Gemma, that's really my overview.
Fantastic. Thank you very much, Rebecca. That was really interesting. We've got lots of questions that are coming through, which is fantastic. So we'll take those at the end and we can discuss it in more detail. At this point, I'd like to invite you, Rebecca, and then you, Brian, to talk about your own personal journey on the Consulting and Coaching for Change programme. We talk a lot about, and Mark's mentioned it, the personal journey that everyone goes through. It's a 7-module programme, so by that very nature, people grow and develop as the modules continue. But I think from the timelines that we've got here for you, Rebecca, if you're happy to talk through it, and then for you, Brian, it really kind of highlights how much change actually takes place for you personally as well as professionally and how they interrelate as well. So if you'd like to, Rebecca, maybe talk through your timeline a little bit in more detail, if that's okay.
Thank you, Gemma. Well, I have to say, as I did at the start of the call, that CCC really came at the right time in my career. I started out in marketing and business development, and I was primarily in the professional services sector, working for a number of big organisations. And by the time I joined EY, I was fully fledged chartered marketeer, and I was doing a lot of work with our global business development community, and I was starting to ask myself some some of the questions that we started to explore at CCC around managing change. It's an organisation that when I joined was about 100,000 employees. Globally, we're now 220,000 employees. So it has been and continues to be on a massive change journey. And so the learning from CCC, or the journey that started with CCC and has continued across the change leaders and beyond, has really mirrored, if you like, that journey at EY, or the two are very intertwined. And Gemma, you and I and Brian also talked about actually that the personal is very much part of that journey as well, which is why on my timeline I sort of reflected that personal journey as well, because it is, for me, very, very interlinked. All of the things that I do and continue to do with my work and outside of work benefited and continue to benefit from the work that was started with CCC. I'm now, I think, as you said, leading this platform globally, Women Fast Forward, and I absolutely, it's not only a passion, a personal passion, but it's, it is great to be engaged in something that has real meaning from a work perspective.
Rebecca,
yeah.
When you talked about the women's program that you helped develop at EY, you talked about some of the things that helped from the program. I was just wondering if you could expand a bit more in telling us kind of how, did any of the learning from the program help you reframe the challenges or contribute to that debate or bring in models or perspectives that were kind of helpful in that?
So, Mark, just for my understanding, so how did CCC impact the work that I've been doing on the Women's Leadership Programme at EY? Is that the question?
That's the question.
Yeah, okay. So my involvement developing EY's Women's Leadership Programme has been limited. So I need to be clear about that, because most of my work for Women Fast Forward is external. So it's very much building on my business development and marketing experience. But one thing I can say about the Women's Leadership Programmes at EY, and we've got 3 different programmes, is we do try very, very hard to make sure that there's a lot of academic research and a lot of well thought out content in those programs. And one of them actually is run at Cranfield, and I think that is very important for me, because I think often with talking to women, in their careers, there is a tendency to internalise it. It must be me, it's what I'm doing, I'm not succeeding, etc., because of me. And actually being able to take it out of that context and say, look, here is systemically, so there's an element that's you, and then there's the systemic element as well. And if you understand both of those, it will help you navigate your careers. And I think that's really where I think CCC was really helpful, that whole being able to articulate it in that way for me. Does that answer your question?
Yeah, that's helpful. Thanks.
Yeah.
Thank you, Rebecca. That's really helpful. And if I can move to you, Brian, for your sort of journey, both personally, professionally, and how it connects and relates to the Consulting, Coaching and Change Programme, please.
Absolutely. I got my start in the San Francisco Bay Area and worked in professional services after university. I went on to be the first head of HR for 2 Silicon Valley startups, one of which did quite a bit of global expansion, and that's when I first started working in the UK, and eventually was introduced to the program at Oxford and HEC, which came at a very good time, because after 2 successive startups where change had really been happening to me, even though I was presumably the one responsible for it, these high growth, high change environments move much too rapidly for the proper kind of reflection. So I think the CCC program brought a fantastic foundation of both academic and then very practical resources and a good personal period of reflection for me to be able to contextualize a lot of what had happened and put it in an entirely new framework, really, for going forward. And so the work I then started doing with Slalom, which is a U.S. regional consultancy like Accenture, and then moving into the work I've done with Astia here in the UK, has really been around trying to help people and then organizations understand the change that they want to actually make happen. So my very quick blurb on Astia is that really we're not a women's network. It's about as balanced an organization and as balanced a business ecosystem as possible, and we certainly don't believe in fixing women. I think that any time we get into segregating women to talk about gender parity, it's reinforcing the idea that they're broken, and that, of course, isn't the case. Women don't need to be fixed. Ecosystems need to be fixed, and really, if that were the case, and men had a monopoly on knowing how to lead well, I think that the world would not look really as dim as it does in certain quarters. So we don't have a monopoly on this, and therefore we really shouldn't be looking to women to fix it. It really has to be a combined effort. And just to reinforce Rebecca's points earlier about the real benefits, we know for a fact that gender diversity just produces higher profits and better governance, greater innovation, and really increases the cognitive and emotional intelligence within groups. And that is a future-looking perspective that we really try to help our businesses, our investors see and embrace. And that if they want to get ahead of their competitors, they will start on this as soon as possible in any number of ways. There are any number of different avenues. It's really the starting point that's the most challenging for some of the reasons that we discussed.
Thank you, Brian.
How's that?
That's really helpful. Thank you so much. That's really useful. And if I can then take you on, Brian, to your next point that Rebecca mentioned earlier around digital disruptors and technology and how that has been utilised for change management in the past, how very much it's a very present part of the future and only growing. If you're happy to tell us a little bit more about your thoughts on that, and again, Mark and Rebecca, if you wish to chip in, please feel free to do so.
Absolutely. These are just two of the many dimensions that go into disrupting certainly the ecosystem from our point of view, which is high growth and high innovation. And it really comes down to all of the visibility that is coming about because of technology and how that then influences innovation and how innovation then leads to more visibility. So the notion is pretty clear if you just take a recent example of these Panama Papers coming to light. We would never have been able to have had such a mass communication in 11 million documents. It's just something that really would have been hard to conceive of even 20 years ago in terms of how you can really publish this and then disseminate it and then figure out what to do with it. So through that little bit of visibility into some human behavior and some business behavior and some government behavior, we're going to have new bits of innovation. There are going to be new ways certainly to crack down on this kind of corporate and personal tax behavior. And we're just hearing information today about Europe looking to band together and create a new way to share information that just wouldn't be possible without digital technologies. Now, of course, it will also lead to innovation on the other side of people who will become smarter and more innovative around how to continually dodge these kinds of tax obligations. But the cycle is really the thing that's most important, because we're not only looking to disrupt elements of business behavior, obviously, they're very, very closely tied to social behavior and then the government's either reaction to that or inaction to it. But it's a wonderful time, especially when you're looking at how new ideas are being discovered, because we can tell new stories, how new ideas are being funded, because the traditional means of starting businesses just don't apply anymore, and really how then it will feed back into new ideas after innovations have been publicized and disseminated and worked through.
That's great. Thank you very much, Brian. That's fantastic. And I think as we've had quite a few questions coming through, I think it might be nice actually to kind of go with those questions while everything's fresh in our minds from the content we've just discussed. And then I'll go on to a little bit more to talk about the change leaders community that I know Brian and Rebecca, you're part of, and Elizabeth Howard's on the line as well, who is the secretary for the change leaders. But we'll come back to that in more detail, in a bit more detail about the programme to kind of help people see the bigger picture, really. So if I can go to the first couple of questions, Rebecca and Brian, I'll come to you each in turn, and Mark, if you want to kind of chip in. So I think the first question was around, Diane has asked around reference to women and ambition, please. So I think, Rebecca, this is around the attrition pyramid, I believe, around sort of, you talked about women being stuck in that kind of middle management phase and not really moving up and beyond that. And I wonder whether you can elaborate on that kind of ambition of women in their roles and what we can do as to what people can do as change agents to kind of really give that more momentum.
Well, I think this comes down to the way that, there's a couple of things. The way that women articulate ambition is different, and that is what Catalyst calls the double bind, you know, damned if you do and damned if you don't. So if you are too ambitious as a woman, you know, you have a label applied to you. If you're not ambitious enough, then, you know, you'll hear comments like, well, you know, we're not sure she's really up for it, you know, we're not sure she's really that interested, you know, she's got a family, or, you know, whatever it is. I think there's another piece that plays out here as well, which is typically, you know, men tend to get promoted on their potential and women on their performance. And so you know, so that is another piece that is quite challenging in the ambition context. So often what you'll hear there is, well, she's not quite ready yet, she hasn't quite demonstrated. Whereas with the man, what you'll hear is, yeah, he can do it. You know, he's got a few rough edges, but, and I'm talking in broad stereotypes here, but that is typically what is playing out here in the ambition context. And when the research has been done by the likes of Michelle Ryan, actually what you find is that women are as ambitious, but they tend to present in different ways because of the things like the double bind.
That helps. Thank you, Rebecca. That's great.
Yeah.
It adds a bit more sort of flesh into the bones for that point. Thank you. I hope that helps, Diane. Do let us know if you need anything else on that. And the next question, if I can ask Brian this question. So as for Rhiannon, as a UK-based company with sites on international expansion, how would you recommend forwarding and making inroads onto ideas of gender parity in countries where this is even more problematic than the UK, which is a really interesting question. Again, Rebecca and Mark, feel free to add, but Brian, as someone that's worked internationally, can you add any light or add any sort of points on this?
Unfortunately, it's even harder to talk about this in countries where there's a socially more conservative definition and conservative reality between genders. And I've done a little bit of work in a country in the Middle East where with a group of women who were looking to invest in London and in Europe. And one of the challenges certainly is that they have to come here, first of all, because it's not something that I can personally be involved in their home country, because of the men and women in the education system. I can't go and teach or do something like that. So the networks are very segregated. So I think we've worked through it by inviting people into the West, so to speak. I mean, to England and to parts of Europe where it's just more acceptable. And then we've looked to show how there are different ways of doing things, but it's mainly been based in the UK as opposed to going to their home countries and trying to work on broad social change. Because I think that in more conservative countries, the social element comes before the business element, and that's a very, very tough thing I would love to hear about examples of people who have been more successful at it. And I'm afraid that's all the answer I can give right now, unless we really wanted to talk about this in great depth.
No, that's fine. Thank you, Brian. That really helps. If I can move to the next question, we've got loads of questions, so I'll probably just ask one of you at a time if that's okay, and obviously we can try to cover as much as we can. This is from someone called Els, and it's regarding major accelerators. So how can we build a supportive environment and create a situation where women support each other at the top? It sometimes looks as a woman that you need to seduce a man to be more visible, and men use their power. How can you overcome this in a more intelligent way, and to stop women becoming reluctant or getting stopped to access the next level? So I think that relates, Rebecca, to the question you answered previously around ambition, but sort of taking on that point around, you mentioned it earlier, Brian, about kind of women pulling up and helping support younger women within the organisation. Is that something you're seeing evidence of in EY, and is it something that you're actively pushing?
So, yeah, I mean, I think that goes back to the point about role modelling. I think many senior women, when you talk to them about their experiences getting to the top, there's a sort of recurring themes that come out. Often it'll be, say, I can't possibly be a role model because I wouldn't want anyone to have the journey that I had to get to the top. Sometimes you speak to women and they say, I don't self-identify with being a woman in this role. I just identify with, you know, this is me as a professional, and this is, you know, being a woman is almost irrelevant, yeah. And I wonder if in that question we're almost alluding to the second group.
Mm-hmm.
And I think that's a challenge, because in many ways historically women have had to norm very much to the you know, the very male majority sort of in leadership, and depending on that leadership culture, it, you know, it could be pretty, I don't know best way to describe this, but I think Brian and Mark know what I mean, pretty full on, you know. And so that is a real legacy piece that we do have when we see some senior women in leadership. I do see it changing. I see organisations like the 30% Club, where you have now some very senior women coming together with mainly men, board chairs, to address the issue of women in the boardroom. That is something that we've never seen to date. So these women are starting to stand up and speak out alongside their sort of male peers, and I think that's really important, and I think we need to do more of that. You know, and I mean, I think a lot of people know the Madeleine Albright quote and all of that, but I think that is important, and it is a shift that I see coming.
Great, that's great to hear that. Thank you, Rebecca. And something you talked about earlier, both you and Brian, around the addressing a conscious effort to address unconscious bias. We've got another question saying, you know, that's great and everybody understands that, but how do you actually do that in practice? How can you actually address the unconscious bias when often, by the very nature of being unconscious, people aren't always aware of it? How can we bring that to the fore as change agents?
Do you want me to jump in?
Yes, please. Go for it, Brian.
Yes. Well, it starts first by addressing if there is an issue within the organization, within the system, and how you specifically go about it in any number of ways. I think that, as I said earlier, I think that there is a point at which this whole argument will tip away from it being unconscious to the territory of it being quite conscious, in the sense that men hold more power in organizations than women, and those men have to sit down and reflect on this and reflect about the future of their organizations. And that's not an unconscious process at all. I don't think that a lot of senior leadership teams dominated by men have to look very hard to uncover the things that are preventing them from leading much more inclusive and progressive and healthy organizations. I think it's probably a pretty straight and short line from where they are right now to the things that they're just not doing. So calling it out is the first way of going about it, and how an individual project or an individual initiative is rolled out, I think is more of the detail work. But very quickly, this is going to get right into the territory of real conscious, gee, I'm here in power, and I don't want to give up any power, and I'm a man, and this is just the way it's been happening for generations. So a lot of that gets into very, very uncomfortable territory, which is another reason that this is so difficult.
Thank you, Brian. That really helps. It kind of gives us a bit of a sort of starting point. As you say, kind of calling it out, I think is absolutely the right key.
Gemma, can I just add very quickly one point on that, because I do think it's so important. I think increasingly there are a number of male leaders who start to recognise the issue of unconscious bias through the fact that they have daughters. Yeah, and so I don't know if anyone's familiar with Michael Kimmel's work on this, but maybe take some time to look at it. There is a real aha moment for a lot of these senior leaders, when they see their daughters go through these issues in the workplace, and it becomes very real, and then they, that is a real moment in time then also to do some work. The other thing that I would just flag is there is a growing trend around unconscious bias training. It can be helpful. I think Facebook, interestingly, has put all of their unconscious bias material on open access. So if anyone is interested in having a look at this topic, then that's probably a good start, as good a starting point as any to go and have a look.
Fantastic. Thank you, Rebecca. And for reference to everybody, I'll put a reference to that book in the email that I'll send out after the webinar later this week as well. So people can use that as another reference point. Got time for maybe one more question. So one question that's come up, and sort of something I've been thinking about as well, there's, as you mentioned, Rebecca, there's so much information, data, articles, research out there around gender parity. It feels like it's kind of everywhere, which is fantastic, but it's equally incredibly hard to kind of wade through all that information and find actually what's the kind of true nature of the problem, what's the actual kind of understanding that kind of really complex problem, to be able to use that data and research as a change agent within your organisation for credible sources to help build your case and to change organisations from within. I guess the question is, how do we wade through all that data without having to spend laborious hours doing so? Is there a way to kind of see the key crucial points that are there? If I could ask Rebecca that question to start with.
Yes, I don't want to plug what we've done with the EY Women Pass Forward report, but that is as good a starting point as any, and then as a result of that, there's bibliography. You can start reading up on different elements depending on where your interest lies. That's probably the quickest answer I can give in 30 seconds.
Great. That's
and maybe I can make a point. One of the, I think, challenges, and this is kind of one of the points we make at CCC, is it's very easy to get bogged down in the rational argument here. It's only one part of the narrative of a kind of future where women have access to similar types of roles and power and resources that men do. There's also pathos, logos, and ethos. So if we deal with the logos, which is the rational facts, that gets us part of the way. But if we want to be effective change agents, we need to connect with pathos, which is the emotional, values-based aspect of change. And also ethos. Is it morally a good thing to do? And I think a lot of the arguments that you set out at the beginning of this seminar, Rebecca, were very much in that kind of rational business case kind of domain. But I think equally important is the kind of moral question here about, should societies be wasting such talented resources per se when we've got such, wicked problems to deal with across lots of areas of society. So I think it's not losing sight of these other aspects that make change happen. It's just not just the providing the data. That's not generally that helps, but it won't tip people into this sort of dynamic of change.
Thank you,
Mark. I totally agree with you, and I think that's a great segue into a plug for the change leaders as a really, really strong component of the whole CCC program. It's been a tremendous living community that's self-organized and self-driven, and a great opportunity to reflect on all three of those dimensions for every member. And so I couldn't recommend CCC or TCL more highly.
Thank you, Brian. That's a nice segue into my next section. Thank you very much. We're just coming to the end of our webinar now, and I'm conscious that people will need to go back to meetings, and I hope that you've enjoyed the webinar. So I just wanted to touch on the change leaders just very briefly, and then talk a little bit about the Consulting Coaching for Change programme, and all of this information was sent to you after the webinar anyway. But as Brian mentioned, the change leaders are organising alumni community. Purely for CCC, Consulting Coaching for Change alumni from lots of different cohorts over the 14 years now it's been running, 14 years the program's been running. So you get a wide breadth of people from different sectors, different roles, different backgrounds, all with that urge and complete commitment to create change. And I was at the conference for one of the days for the change leaders last weekend in Paris, and I can say that it's a really interesting, engaging discussions, people that are willing to help, support and network, and sort of echo what Brian's opportunity to really gain that kind of really supportive network, whether, you know, male, female, it's sort of again a kind of whole family really is how I'd describe it. And Elizabeth Howard is one of our panellists today. I hope that kind of the family approach makes sense, Elizabeth. That's the way that I kind of see the community.
Yes, a family that has lots of arguments and debates within it, so I call family.
Just like a real family. So that's perfect, thank you. And anybody that comes onto the programme can join to the Change Leaders. There's a very active LinkedIn group as well as the conferences I've mentioned, and lots of informal discussions and networking amongst the groups. So just to finish off, I just want to discuss to talk about the main points of the Consulting Coaching for Change programme. As you all know, it's a joint programme from Saïd Business School and HEC in Paris. We run the programme from Oxford and Paris, so you get a kind of truly sort of European approach and angle with all the sessions taught in English. We have 7 modules starting this year on the 29th of November, and we are accepting applications now, and we have further details. We have a lady called Miranda Peterson at HEC Paris, who is our programme advisor, who can discuss kind of any questions around the programme, you know, points on this particular webinar, which I'm happy to take those questions afterwards, and my contact details along with Miranda's will be in the email going out before the end of the week to you all, including the slides and the recording. And we'd just very much like to hear your thoughts on how the webinar's been for you, any suggestions for future webinars, and we're planning to run a series of these across this year and into next year, and we hope that you've really enjoyed it. I think it's been a really fantastic discussion, so I wanted to say thank you to Rebecca Hill, and thank you to Brian Evje, and to Mark Thompson, of course, and Elizabeth joining us for the really interesting debate today. And there's nothing else to add. I'll wrap up now, and hope you have a good and enjoyable rest of the day, and we'll be in touch shortly. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks for hosting, Gemma.
Thank you.
Thanks.